there is something about beauty that is primary today. And beauty is not merely an aesthetic symmetry, but it is a strike. It is a strike of beauty that is not merely up to your taste. It's that of which paralyzes you and makes you go, oh. And so that sort of strike, that sort of paralysis that has, that sort of freezing that has consequence is very, very important. And the question becomes the following: if you foreclose, drop the name of the Father, do you increase or decrease the probability you experience the strike of beauty? If the answer is that you decrease it, this is very, very consequential, because then there is no possibility of something that could strike you as beyond yourself as other, that says, like the famous local poem, you must change your life, right? But maybe there's an idea that many people, because the name of God has actually become a certain idolatry, as Peter Rowland says, it's actually a kind of idol to them, that actually dropping the name of God, for them in particular, might actually have them be struck by beauty, which actually could then be the possibility of the opening.
Allow that strike.
Yeah, that's correct, right? So there's this interesting issue where, for me, the question of the dropping of the name of the Father is, I don't want to relativize it. I want to make it conditional. And we talk about condition versus, there's objectivity, there's relativism. Michelle and I talk a lot about conditionalism, meaning there are certain conditions that have to be met for X to be the case. That doesn't mean X isn't the case. That means there are certain conditions. So, for example, a rainbow, as Owen Barfield talks about. Do rainbows exist? Yes, but under certain conditions, right? It's not just a matter of opinion. Based on the Japanese, in praise of shadows. What about shadows? Shadows require certain conditions. There has to be light here, object here. So there are conditions that have to be met. I think basically many of the most important things for humans to do are conditional. They are matters of conditions that have to be created, and it's very hard to make those conditions, and those conditions can also, once you get to certain rituals, be very dangerous, because there are real forces that you're dealing with. But if you don't deal with conditions, then you end up just going back and forth. You're kind of trapped in a dialectic, per se, or a back and forth between objective or subjective, when really it's conditionalism. So for me, there are certain conditions where dropping the name of the Father is actually dropping an idolatry that actually makes you open to the Trinity. That makes you open to the Father, right? But there are other conditions where actually taking up the name of the Father actually then opens you up to the Trinity. Precisely because, I guess for me, in the presentation, so every worldview has a way to appear heretical. So basically, Christian atheism can look heretical to atheists, right? And so likewise, taking up the name of the Father can actually look heretical to people who are within, say, an atheist worldview, when really you might be taking it up to see what happens, right? You don't necessarily believe, but you can take it up to see what happens, right? But this is also where that distinction between belief and faith, because what Jesus shows, this is why to me it's a very big deal to put emphasis on the act of sitting with sinners, with the act of courage or different things, because anyone can do those things, regardless what your worldview is, right? And if these things actually then condition you and open new conditions of possibility, then one can actually do these things without necessarily wholesaling dropping everything they believe or changing what they think. And I think really basing that on the question, like Jesus. I think many American Christians especially hear the phrase, like Jesus, as I'll have the same beliefs as Jesus, right? I'll have the same dogmas as Jesus. But if you really look at what Jesus does, which obviously I'm emphasizing with appearing heretical, which is the key to fulfillment, well, anyone could do that. Anyone can do that in any worldview. You can appear heretical. And I can imagine, to the question you're presenting that's extremely important, I can see what appears heretical for one person being dropping the name of the Father, for another person it could be taking it up. But the critical point, though, I would say to both of that, is whatever you do, it has to be for the sake of making you open to that which is radically other and potentially terrifying. I don't think taking up the name of the Father or dropping the name of the Father, if it is not a practice of opening you to this radical otherness, will be any good, right? There are many people who convert to a religion precisely to close off everything, right? But then there are also people that can leave a religion because they don't want to have to go to the same Sunday service and run into people that they have nothing in common with and learn to interact with them, right? So you're leaving so you don't have to deal with that otherness, right? The strike of beauty which I do think the strike of the mystical ultimately is at the heart of so much. But the problem is, of course, the mystical can destroy you, right? I guess is what I want to say. It's to your present. Like I always talk about lovecraft with the craft in parentheses, right? You must always be dealing with a lovecraft, which means you're risking being reduced to ash, but also the love that moves the sun and the stars, right? So what is the practice that a given person needs to do in their worldview, which for me is always going to have basically something to do on a gradual scale of appearing heretical, that is going to make them open and take seriously the Lovecraft of life. The fact that there is a Lovecraft to reality with the craft in parentheses, right? That's what always has to be central. And the question of taking up the Father or dropping the Father, I think, has to be situated with that opening to something that has a certain terror to it. But that terror is good, like good terror. I mean, the other, I guess I would also say this before giving it back to you, is that a lot of this enclosure, disclosure, openness within a structure, girdle point. In the girdle point, let's put it this way. In the girdle point, you get these very paradoxical realities, like a terrible goodness, a dreadful love, a piercing beauty, right? You get these things that seem to contradict one another. But they actually don't. They only do in algebra and geometry, they do not. You can, of course, encounter a terrifying love in a person, or a terrifying love in reality, or a terrifying beauty in a thunderstorm, right? A lot of things that seem to be contradictions actually on a higher dimensionality are not. You can have these descriptions and they actually be getting at a certain truth, right? In the girdle point, you're often dealing with realities that have this higher geometry, because the girdle point is precisely an opening of algebra to geometry. It's saying that you cannot, in a single dimension, get the full picture. Well, that means it can't be flat. And if it can't be flat, then you're talking dimensions. And you're now moving to geometry, because practically speaking, algebra is a geometry of one dimension, right? If you just, that's what it is, right? So you're practically algebraic if you don't have the girdle point. Well, that means it makes no sense to talk about terrifying loves or, piercing beauties or things like that. But in the girdle point, these things all make sense. So basically, the praxis of the girdle point are those of which make you able to handle those kind of encounters and open to those kind of encounters. Like you can experience that beyond what you can comprehend. And basically, that's what you're putting yourself up to in the girdle point. And then, of course, also in appearing heretical, you are being a certain representation to others around you of that which they cannot comprehend, but actually is included in their worldview. They just haven't comprehended it yet. That's why it's an appearance of heresy versus a being of heresy. But let me give it back to you on any thoughts on anything.
That I just love yours and Michelle's concept of conditionality as opposed to relativism. That is really, really useful. Cribbing it, taking it with me. Thank you. In my pocket. Most people are either recovering from a terrible fundamentalist wound or emerging from a totally secular worldview. And there's a kind of innate modern anti-ritual line of thinking. And I think that's because ritual is always seen as enclosure, where in fact it's a repetition in the Deleuzian sense. It foregrounds difference, right? It stabilizes this so that you can see that. And so I'm very curious as how do you see the role of these. First of all, an invented ritual is a contradiction in terms, because the essence of ritual is repetition. So we do invent rituals, and we have to, and we will, and we sort them out based on enough repetition to know what has legs. That's just the way rituals act. But for the most part, they're in that sense an inherently conservatizing force. But that can be a force of disclosure, the way history can, right? It can be precisely the opposite of what you might intuitively think. So I would love to hear, first of all, what you think is the conditionality for ritual, behind which is the question of the conditionality for church.